Aside from the world of politics, there is probably no greater arena for the clash of egos than a Hollywood film set. The tabloid industry grew almost entirely out of reporting on industry feuds, and there were none juicier than when a star would pull rank and get their own director booted from a project. When video games are covered in the news, it's usually with a sense of alarm about people who don't leave their house enough, or how it affects children. Now that so many of us are staying home to protect others during the pandemic, the World Health Organization is concerned about our mental health. It didn't happen a lot, but when it did it made huge waves, to the point where the Directors Guild eventually had to intervene and limit the scope of a star's power. Isolating from others, and hearing about terrible news every day is leading to very high numbers of people suffering from mental health disorders. One of the ways to help counteract this issue is apparently with video games, as Oxford University recently performed a study using real-time data for gameplay and found positive results. Newsy recently spoke to Dr. But it wouldn't be Hollywood if there weren't some great behind-the-scenes stories, right? Here are the actors who got their directors fired. Clint Eastwood, as we just mentioned, in 1976, the Directors Guild implemented a strict set of guidelines aimed at protecting the financial and creative rights of its members, according to How Stuff Works. Rachel Cowart, the research director of a nonprofit group dedicated to examining mental health and our relationship to video games. Her organization, Take This, is approaching her research from a different angle. What this meant in practice was that, no actor, producer or other person engaged in a film may fire the film's director and assume his duties and title. The rule became known as the Eastwood Rule, as a result of the conflict between Clint Eastwood and the outlaw Josie Wales director, Philip Kaufman. Eastwood famously relieved Kaufman of his directing duties just 2 weeks into shooting after allegedly growing frustrated with Kaufman's slow, methodical style and unwavering desire to create the perfect shot, no matter how much time it took. Eastwood replaced Kaufman with himself, but Kaufman retained the screenwriting credit. Decades later, in an interview with Venice magazine, Kaufman shed some light, and some serious shade, on the whole situation. Clint, for whatever reason, decided we had some creative differences. He was the producer. He was the biggest star in the world. One of us had to go. She said, I think it's best when we have these discussions about games to come from a space of curiosity, and come from a space of looking at them as just one of the tools in our toolbox, and not this horrible thing that's ruining the children. She also discussed the connection between video games and self-determination theory, which focuses on our basic psychological needs. Laughs, it wasn't my choice, so, I've never seen it, actually. This includes the need to feel competition, autonomous, and to feel related to other people. I hear it's very good. Apparently Eastwood also felt it was an effective move, because Kaufman's directorial scalp wasn't the only one. Eastwood would claim director Bruce Beresford felt the full force of Eastwood's star power when he was ousted, left, the bridges of Madison County after creative differences, with the film's lead. While every video game isn't designed in a way that will meet any or all of these needs, many games can. Though the eponymous rule blocked Eastwood from firing Beresford directly, his backchanneling against the director, specifically in terms of his insistence on casting Meryl Streep to play opposite him over Beresford's preferred choices of Lena Olin or Isabella Rossellini, according to TCM, was enough to get Beresford to leave the film. Beresford confirmed the hostile environment in an interview with the Border Mail, during which he said, "The reason I didn't do Madison County was that although I worked on it for about a year, Clint Eastwood wanted to direct it. When they do, playing games can help increase our sense of overall well-being and happiness." It's worth noting that more study on our relationship between video games and mental health is needed. We don't know enough for there to be a guidebook on how to use games to improve our lives. In fact, addiction to gaming can be a serious problem, and the World Health Organization is even looking into this issue. He was always sort of polite in a rather offhand way, but he was basically uncooperative when I was preparing it, and I finally went to the studio and I said, "Look, it's never gonna work like this. But when we play the right games and have a healthy relationship with them, they can greatly improve our mental health." I said, "You better let Clint direct it and I'll go." In fact, counselors are looking into ways to gamify counseling. I just pulled out. Is anyone else surprised that Dirty Harry sort of sounds like a teenager who sulks until he gets his way in this scenario? Clark Gable Gone with the Wind is full of high drama set to the backdrop of the Civil War. Many have found tools like Habitica to be useful in gamifying their daily lives. A recent study done by Oxford University supports these claims. One of the Oxford team of researchers, Andrew Shabilsky, said they found that video game companies themselves had very little real, hard data when it came to gameplay. Previous research done on how gaming affects mental health has used self-reported questionnaires to reveal how much time someone spends playing. It's easy to say, 5 more minutes, mean it, and find that you've somehow played for 2 hours. And apparently, the production of the film was also something of a battlefield, including massive fights over casting, scripting, and of course, directing. In his account of the behind-the-scenes turmoil, which he describes as Hollywood's biggest scandal, film critic Emmanuel Levy chronicles the rancor between lead actor Clark Gable and the film's original director, George Cukor. Self-reporting how much time you spent playing a video game isn't the most effective way to provide such information. The Oxford team used real data from people's devices, combined with questionnaires on overall happiness and how people were feeling. There is no doubt that Gable's dislike of Cukor contributed to his dismissal, Levy writes. Apparently Gable protested vigorously at MGM that Cukor was more of a woman's director, which at the time was a pejorative concept that led Gable to believe his role in the film would be diminished as a result. But it wasn't entirely Gable's dislike of Cukor that got him bounced from the film. They studied players of the games Plants vs. Zombies, Battle for Neighborville and Animal Crossing, New Horizons. They found that people who played more had a greater sense of well-being. When talking to The Guardian about the study, Andrew Shabilsky noted that he was sure that with further study, they'd discover more about how gaming could also potentially harm mental health. Cukor's longtime friend and legendary producer, David O. Selznick, was the man who made the final call on Cukor's termination. This study only focused on 2 games of a laid-back nature. Cukor and Selznick battled from the start over Selznick's micromanagement of the film, including his insistence on reviewing the block rehearsal of each scene before it was shot, meaning Cukor couldn't even yell, "Action," without Selznick's approval. Results from role-playing games or more violent video games could be very different. Cukor, of course, pushed back on Selznick's meddling, leading to an increasingly tense environment on set. Until they have more research and better guidelines, it's up to us to monitor our reactions, talk with mental health professionals, and continue making the most thoughtful decisions about our mental health as we can. On top of that, Selznick had campaigned hard to get Gable to do the film, leaving Gable in a position of considerable leverage when it came to his gripes about Cukor. In the end, Gable won Selznick over. Cukor was out, and replaced with Victor Fleming. But Cukor didn't go out without a parting shot. Levy writes that Cukor once told a reporter, "It is nonsense to say that I was giving too much attention to Vivian and Olivia, the film's female leads. It is the text that dictates where the emphasis should go." Gable didn't have a great deal of confidence in himself as an actor, although he was a great screen personality. Maybe he thought that I didn't understand that. Kirk Douglas. Another actor-director spat of lore was the one between Kirk Douglas and Anthony Mann on the set of the gladiator epic, Spartacus. According to most accounts, including this one by TCM, Douglas was never happy with the studio's choice of Mann as a director. He seemed scared of the scope of the picture. "I fought with the studio to replace him. But they had done well financially with him, and ignored all my pleas," Douglas said. After a few weeks of shooting, Douglas's suspicions about Mann's directorial deficiencies seemed to be confirmed, and Mann was replaced with Stanley Kubrick, who Douglas's had been pitching to direct all along. Though Mann's axing has consistently been laid at Douglas's feet, since he also served as exec producer on the film, Douglas clarified what really happened in his 2012 book, I Am Spartacus, Making a Film, Breaking the Blacklist. According to The Hollywood Reporter, Douglas wrote in the memoir, "I'm no Donald Trump, but I did it," apparently referencing the famous catchphrase from The Apprentice. Douglas continued, "He was so gracious, and I said, I owe you a picture, and a few years later I did a picture with him."
That's not exactly the bad blood scenario it has always been portrayed as, and in fact, that film that Douglas and Mann finally made together, The Heroes of Telemark 1965, ended up being the last completed film of Mann's career. He died 3 years later in the middle of production on a dandy in Aspic. Val Kilmer. The Island of Dr. Moreau holds a place in cinematic history as one of the worst films ever made, despite the fact that it was painstakingly adapted and shepherded by director Richard Stanley over the course of 4 years. But that apparently meant nothing to Val Kilmer, who helped torpedo Stanley's set with rude and abrasive behavior, including an instance during a scene in which he sat on the ground and refused to stand up, according to the Telegraph. In addition to other elements hinting at Stanley's inability control of his production, like the temporary exit of star Marlon Brando, and disastrous weather elements, Kilmer's behavior was the last straw for studio execs who eventually replaced Stanley with veteran director John Frankenheimer just 3 days after shooting began. But Kilmer proved to be just as much of a nuisance for Frankenheimer, who allegedly later remarked, "Even if I was directing a film called The Life of Val Kilmer, I wouldn't have that P***** K in it." In his own defense during a Reddit AMA, Kilmer said Frankenheimer was desperate for a comeback and blamed me for the film's failure, which he said didn't make sense because the film was still bad after his death scene. Amazing logic there, Iceman. Kevin Costner. As is the case with The Island of Dr. Moreau, the production problems that plagued Waterworld were matched only by the bickering between the film's director, Kevin Reynolds, and star, Kevin Costner. Though they were frequent collaborators, having worked together on Dances with Wolves and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Costner and Reynolds' working relationship broke down under what Reynolds later described in a 2008 Sunday Times interview as incredible pressure due to the fact that it was the most expensive film ever made. Though he did insist that they've repaired the relationship now that they're older and wiser, and having come to the realization that life is too short. Reynolds was less diplomatic years earlier, around the time of the film's 1995 premiere, when he told EU, in the future Costner should only appear in pictures he directs himself. That way he can always be working with his favorite actor and his favorite director. Zing. Costner, also speaking to EU in January of 2012, seemed to have evolved his perspective on the feud over time. He said, "We had differences. It happens, especially when the stakes are as high as they were with Waterworld. But out of fire comes steel. And I've always had a real belief in him as a director." In fact, Costner was speaking with the press at that time to promote his well-received miniseries, Hatfields and McCoys, which Watson directed, providing definitive proof that all of their burying the hatchet talk wasn't just Hollywood lip service. Burt Reynolds. Many of these on-set altercations were undoubtedly tense and uncomfortable, but the only one on this list that ever ended in physical violence is thanks to Burt Reynolds and his well-known penchant for beating the crap out of colleagues he disagrees with. In a New York Times Magazine profile of the rough-and-tumble star, Reynolds is said to have thrown the director of Riverboat, his first TV show, into the water, as well as sailed producer Joel Silver out of his trailer. He even admits that his costliest fight happened when he punched out Heat director Dick Richards, after Richards tapped Reynolds on the chest. Post-Slugfest, Richards left the set of Heat and sued Reynolds for $25 million. Amazingly, Richards was somehow persuaded to come back to the film, only to later fall from a camera crane and have to be hospitalized. And to add insult to literal injuries, that lawsuit Richards filed didn't exactly turn out as planned either. "I spent $500,000 for that punch," Reynolds told The Times, revealing a substantially downgraded settlement from what Richards originally sought. Reynolds also joked, "If I hit a guy, it's certain that he will run a studio or become a huge director." We're not sure Dick Richards would agree with that assessment. Burt Lancaster. As is the case with many of these scenarios, creative differences were said to be at the heart of star, Burt Lancaster, and director, Arthur Penn's fallout on the set of the World War II drama, The Train. According to TCM, Lancaster, who was also producing the film, felt that Penn was neglecting the story's potential for action and suspense. But that's putting a shiny veneer on what, according to biographer Kate Buford, was actually an ego play on the part of Lancaster.
In her book, Burt Lancaster, An American Life, Buford interviews Walter Bernstein, the screenwriter who wrote The Train, and who was also present when Penn was unceremoniously kicked to the curb after the first day of shooting and replaced with John Frankenheimer. Bernstein tells Buford he was appalled at what he felt was deeply unfair, and also remembers Lancaster saying, "Frankenheimer is a bit of a whore, but he'll do what I want." Years later, in an interview with Bright Lights Film, Penn seems to confirm this characterization of both Lancaster and Frankenheimer when he refers his firing as a simple, very bad piece of nonsense that Burt Lancaster pulled. Penn claims that for economic reasons, Lancaster and Frankenheimer schemed behind his back to replace him all along, which Frankenheimer later acknowledged to Penn along with an admission that he was an alcoholic during those years, and completely under the sway of Lancaster. Yeesh. What is the deal with Hollywood stars named Burt? Gloria Swanson and Erich von Stroheim were giants of the silent film world. So, when they teamed up for Queen Kelly in 1928, which Senses of Cinema claims was, to be director Stroheim's masterpiece, the expectations were high. But Stroheim also had a reputation for eccentricity and pushing the envelope of good taste. So, he misrepresented the film's controversial nature when pitching it to Swanson and her producing partner and then paramour, Joseph P. Kennedy. Yes, JFK's old man. Anyway, after it became clear that Stroheim was making a scandalous and provocative film that she never agreed to, by failing to cut a brothel scene, and allegedly instructing a co-star to drool on her hand, in another, Swanson complained to Kennedy and had Stroheim terminated. Swanson eventually finished the film, but in protest, Stroheim blocked its release in the U.S. for decades until after the two reunited for their classic roles in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. In a genius casting move, Stroheim played Max von Mayerling, the butler to Swanson's Norma Desmond, a washed-up silent film star. Both would receive Oscar nominations for their roles, and Queen Kelly would eventually get a U.S. release and become a cult classic. Now that sounds like a Hollywood ending.